Welcome to Student Voice. I'm your host, Edward Smith. Today we will journey into the minds of the American youth and discover the root of voter apathy among college students. With the upcoming presidential election, many people, especially college students, are exhausted with the concept of voting. Students often say, "My vote doesn't matter. All politicians are corrupt," or simply, "Who cares?" This cynicism is very common, and hopefully we can shed some light on why voting is important. Joining us today to help abolish voting, cynicism, our doctor and queen of all podcasting, and associate professor of political science, Liz Norell, and global scholars history major, Alex Osborn. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having me.
So Alex, I wanted to ask you, what issues usually motivate younger voters?
Well, that is I found it to be kind of a hard question to answer and maintain political neutrality. So I'm going to try to do so the best I can. So I don't want to influence anybody because everybody's voice matters. But I actually have two general answers. One is my personal opinion, and one is kind of hard data that I found. So there was a poll run by the Washington Post back in 2018 asking that same question, trying to discover the answer to that same question. And the big three that really reciprocated and popped up over and over again was immigration, reproductive rights, and racial injustice. Those were the big three that seemed to motivate young voters to get to the polls. Education popped up too, but it didn't seem motivational for younger voters. But it also seemed to be split between communities of color and young communities of color and young white voters as well. So young communities of color found that racial injustice, income equality, and immigration were the primary focuses for them. For white voters, it was immigration, Roe v. Wade, and taxes. So that's just kind of what the hard data finds. For me, the motivation comes from a goal of freedom for all, right? So, the First Amendment defines a free individual as one that has the right to vote, the right to speak their mind as they please, the right to worship as they please, and a right for the press to cover what they please. But unfortunately, that's just not something that happens in the United States for everyone. It's the 13th Amendment says neither slavery or involuntary servitude is legal except as for a punishment as a crime. So, since the Constitution doesn't specify whether or not that means that only applies to those who are currently serving the punishment or forever as a punishment for that crime, it's left to the states to decide. And there's only two states that never take away the right to vote, and that's Vermont and Maine. And there's a lot of other states of have to petition for their freedom rights. 18 states, they have to petition for their freedom to come back, and none of those states are located in the Southeast. So for me, until everybody has the right to have their voice, the right to speak their mind, and express that individual freedom and have that freedom, I will always exercise my right to vote because there's people who can't.
Very salient
if I could just
points.
add on to that for a second.
Yes, go ahead, Dr. Noah.
I was just going to say, I think, every once in a while there's a candidate that comes around. Barack Obama was one of them, who really energizes young voters for reasons that I still can't fully understand totally. But Bernie Sanders was also one of those candidates. But generally speaking, if we look at voter turnout across all demographics, turnout is higher when things are not going as well, and turnout is lower when people are kind of humming along pretty well. And so I think that young voters are no different than other voters in that when things feel like they're kind of at a crisis point, we're going to see more people vote.
Very good points. Dr. Norell, how do you think on top of that the pandemic is going to affect the election this year?
Well, I think what we hear from the two major party candidates for president are very different messages about exactly that. But it does seem to me that the pandemic is going to make it a little more challenging for some people to vote just because of precautions needed around keeping social distance and sanitizing voting machines. And I do think that there are some people who feel like their vote may not be as they may not be able to trust that their vote will be counted as much as we've seen in past elections. But I also think that this pandemic is motivating a lot of people to have their voice heard in a way that perhaps they haven't felt in past elections. So, I don't really know whether turnout is going to be much higher or much lower, but I do think that this is a very live question right now.
I did also want to ask you, so we're talking about voter apathy. So do you think that how the debates went down last night, do you think that's going to increase apathy among young students?
It's a good question, Edward. I asked my students about the debate last night in our morning class. I just gave about 5 minutes for people to share whatever thoughts they had. And I think in general, their response was, I'm just going to hold my nose and vote if I'm going to vote at all. And I think, what we're seeing, and I've seen this in every election that I have watched since I was a kid, we always sort of have this feeling that none of the major party candidates are candidates that we can get super excited about often. And I certainly think that what we saw at the first debate reinforced that idea that nobody's super, super excited about either of these candidates. I do think, though, that when you see two men in their 70s interrupting each other for 90 minutes nonstop, it does tend to have this, it turns people off. It makes them feel like, why should I can't listen to this. I can't watch this. Why should I care? And I do think that that's to the detriment of everyone, and especially young voters.
And before I move on, before I go back, I want to ask you both, are you going to buy Will You Shut Up Man t-shirts?
I have no plans to do so.
All right. So, Alex, I want to know if someone finds themselves getting frustrated with politics, what's the best way to stay level-headed and not check out of all the issues?
Find what you're passionate about and remember that, for me, I do my best to stay educated as much as possible using, neutral news sources. There's a great resource called, if you Google media bias chart, there you can identify resources or news sources that can just give you the facts straight up and then allow you to formulate your own opinion. Remember what you believe in and just stay focused. Stay focused on that, on your passion and your beliefs. And if you don't know those, find out what you believe in. There's a great resource Dr. Norell actually had us take in her political science class. It's on isidewith.com, and it's their 2020 political quiz. It basically runs through all of the issues that are currently prevalent in the United States, and actually tells you at the end of it, based on the information that you provide, and they give you full detailed explanations of those issues and why, and to let you decide informally what you believe in. At the end of it, it'll tell you who represents you based on your answers to the quiz. If you don't know what you believe in, find out what you believe in, and then find out who identifies with you, and stay focused.
And Dr. Norell, do you have anything to add on that?
I think, my perspective is that politics is always going to be frustrating, but I think, as Alex has said, if you can keep in mind the stakes here And for me, the stakes aren't found in numbers or statistics. It's in the stories of people who have been affected by government, including each of us and the people in our lives. And so if you can remember that these elections do matter all the way down the ballot, I mean, local elections are some of the most consequential in terms of how they impact our lives. That's a really good way to stay motivated to continue to pay attention.
Very well put. And Dr. Norell, how do you convince a younger person that voting is even worth it?
This is one of my favorite things to talk about, Edward.
Perfect.
So I think if you are voting because you think that your vote is going to change the outcome of an election, you're probably voting for the wrong reason. And that's probably a strange thing to say as a political scientist, but there are just very, very few elections where one vote would have made a difference. Although they do happen, and one happened in the last 2 years in a Virginia legislative race where it was a dead tie and they had to decide it by a coin flip. But that's rare. A lot of students will often tell me that they feel like their vote doesn't count. And I always push back on that because, yes, your vote will be counted. It will be counted. The real question is, does my vote matter? And that's where I think I can make the best argument. And my argument is that voting isn't just about who wins, it's about what they do after they win. And when whole groups of people choose not to engage in the democratic process, the government everyone in government has a legitimate reason to ignore that group. So young people and students vote in much lower numbers than any other demographic group. And that means the government has no incentive to do anything to help young people because they're not engaged. The best reason to vote is it sends a message to your elected officials that you're paying attention and that you want them to do something for you to take you into account. And if we saw some of the more marginalized communities in our country voting in the same rates that old white people do, we would have a radically different government. And so that's my best argument, that if you vote, your vote matters because it says government needs to work for me too.
That was beautiful. Your passion is admirable. And Alex, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that? No? Well, in that case, now that we are all feeling passionate, that's all for this episode of Student Voice. Thanks for joining us as we attempted to tear down the walls of apathy and replace it with a skyscraper of passion and enthusiasm. For more information about voting locally, visit elect.hamiltontn.gov. Have a great day, everyone.